world was told Africa had no history, no empires, no power. But that lie only works if you never ask who controlled the gold, who educated the scholars, and who the world once bowed to in silence. Tonight, we uncover the age when Africa ruled the world. Chapter 1. Before the world was divided, before borders, before continents were ranked, before history decided who would be called civilized and who would be called primitive, Africa stood at the center of the human story, not on the margins, not in the shadows, but at the very core of organized power. Along the Nile Valley, civilization did not slowly emerge. It was engineered. More than 5,000 years ago, while much of the world lived in scattered tribes, the Nile gave rise to something radically different: centralized authority, written administration, taxation, law, and long-term state planning. This was not survival. This was governance. Ancient Egypt was not a miracle of stone alone. It was a machine of order. Censuses were conducted. Harvests were recorded. Land was measured after every flood. Bureaucrats managed food reserves, labor forces, and massive infrastructure projects that lasted generations. Power here was not chaos. It was continuity. South of Egypt, the kingdom of Kush rose not as a copy, but as a rival. Kushite kings ruled from Napata and later Meroe, controlling trade routes that linked Central Africa to the Mediterranean world. They minted their own coins, built monumental pyramids, and at one point did the unthinkable. African rulers conquered Egypt itself, forming the 25th dynasty. For nearly a century, pharaohs of African origin ruled one of the most powerful states on earth. This was not a peripheral civilization. This was a transfer of imperial control. The Nile Valley functioned as an early global corridor. Gold, ivory, incense, grain, and ideas flowed north and south. Africa was not isolated. It was interconnected long before the word globalization existed. And crucially, power here was institutional. Kings ruled, but systems endured. Law outlived rulers. Administration survived dynasties. Authority was embedded into the state itself. This is the foundation of modern governance, and it was already operational in Africa, while much of Europe had no cities to govern. The idea that Africa was late to civilization collapses the moment the Nile speaks. Africa was not waiting for history to arrive. History was already happening there. What later generations would call the ancient world was, in reality, deeply African at its core. Europe did not invent statecraft. It inherited fragments of it centuries later. But when history was eventually written by those who came to dominate the globe, the center was redrawn. Africa was pushed outward, its role minimized, its power reframed as myth. Yet the evidence remains, in stone, in records, in systems that shaped the world. Because while much of the world was learning to survive, Africa was learning to govern. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Gold That Moved the World. Power does not always announce itself with armies. Sometimes it arrives quietly. In gold. In the 13th century, long before Europe controlled global finance, the heartbeat of the world's wealth pulsed from West Africa. At its center stood the Mali Empire, vast, disciplined, and unimaginably rich. This was not a land of scattered tribes. This was an economic superpower. Mali sat atop the largest known gold reserves on Earth. For centuries, nearly half of the Old World's gold flowed from African soil. But gold alone does not create power. Control does. The Mali state regulated extraction, taxed trade, and secured routes that stretched across the Sahara. Caravans moved with military protection. Markets were standardized. Authority reached from deep African mines to the ports of the Mediterranean. At the heart of this system stood Mansa Musa. In 1324, Musa embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca that would become legend, not for its piety, but for its economic impact. Traveling with tens of thousands of attendants and tons of gold, he distributed wealth so freely in Cairo that the value of gold collapsed. Prices soared, currencies weakened. An African king had unintentionally destabilized international markets. The shock rippled outward, through Egypt, the Levant, and into Europe. For over a decade, the effects lingered. Economies adjusted. Chroniclers recorded it in disbelief. This was not symbolism. This was monetary power on a global scale. And yet, Musa's pilgrimage was not an accident of excess. It revealed something deeper. Africa was already integrated into the world economy. Trade routes tied Mali to North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Gold moved east. Salt moved south. Knowledge and culture traveled with them. Mali did not simply possess wealth, it administered it. Taxes funded infrastructure. Gold financed education, mosques, and governance. Timbuktu flourished not because of charity, but because of policy. Wealth was transformed into institutional strength. This is what empires do. While Europe's kingdoms struggled with fragmented authority and scarce resources, African states mastered abundance. They understood that wealth, when organized, could shape the world beyond borders. But here lies the irony. The same gold that elevated Africa would eventually lure others toward it. Maps were redrawn, stories exaggerated, legends of endless riches spread across Europe. What had once been trade routes became targets. And as the global balance of power shifted, Africa's role as the engine of wealth was slowly rewritten, recast as a supplier, not a controller. Yet the truth remains buried in economic records and forgotten shockwaves. Africa did not stumble upon gold. It governed it. It taxed it. It projected power through it. This was not wealth discovered by chance. It was wealth organized, taxed, and weaponized. And the world felt it. Chapter 3. Knowledge without permission. Gold can build empires, but knowledge sustains them. While outsiders fixated on Africa's wealth, a quieter power was taking shape, one that could not be looted by force or measured in coins. Across the Sahel, along the trade routes of the Mali and later Songhai empires, cities of learning rose from the desert. At their center stood Timbuktu, not a myth, not a legend, but one of the most important intellectual capitals of the medieval world. By the 14th century, Timbuktu housed universities, libraries, and schools that attracted scholars from across Africa, North Africa, and the Islamic world. Students studied law, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, theology, and philosophy. Degrees were awarded, teachers were paid, manuscripts were copied, debated, and preserved. This was not informal. Learning passed through folklore. This was institutional knowledge. Thousands of handwritten manuscripts filled private and public libraries, texts on planetary movement, surgical techniques, trade law, ethics, and governance. Scholars did not merely repeat inherited ideas, they questioned them. Astronomers in West Africa charted stars and seasons, aligning calendars with agriculture and navigation. Jurists debated legal frameworks that balanced religious principles with social realities. Physicians documented treatments using local and imported medical knowledge. Africa was not waiting for instruction, it was producing insight. Knowledge moved along the same routes as gold. Caravans carried books as carefully as bullion. Scholars traveled freely between cities, creating a network of intellectual exchange that stretched from West Africa to Cairo, Baghdad, and beyond. This mattered because knowledge confers legitimacy. Rulers who supported scholarship gained authority, not through fear, but through law. Governance was reinforced by education. Policy was shaped by debate. Power was explained, justified, and restrained. This was a different model of empire, one built not on conquest alone, but on comprehension. Meanwhile, much of Europe remained fragmented. Literacy was limited. Books were rare, expensive, and often restricted to monasteries. Learning survived, but narrowly. The contrast is uncomfortable, because when Europe was copying books by candlelight, Africa was debating law under the desert sun. And yet, this intellectual legacy was never fully absorbed into global memory. As power shifted and trade routes changed, centers of African learning were sidelined. Manuscripts were ignored, hidden, or destroyed. Scholars were erased from the canon. History preferred a simpler narrative, one where knowledge flowed in a single direction. But the manuscripts still exist. Tens of thousands survive today. Written in Arabic and African scripts, preserved by families who understood their value long after the world forgot. They testify to a truth that challenges everything we were taught. Africa was not an empty classroom. It was a lecture hall, and its scholars asked questions powerful enough to govern empires without ever asking permission to be remembered. Chapter 4. Empires Built Without Stone Thrones. Power does not always announce itself with towers, battlements, or gilded halls. Sometimes it whispers through rivers, flows along trade routes, and rises in cities of stone without thrones. Africa's empires understood this. They shaped influence without imitating Europe. They governed not by monumentality alone, but by vision, networks, and adaptability. In the West, the Songhai Empire ruled along the Niger River. Its authority flowed like the water itself, connected, constant, vital. Governors oversaw provinces, collected taxes, and enforced law along the waterways that sustained trade and agriculture. Markets thrived, and goods, from gold to salt, moved seamlessly under an administration that understood geography as power. Songhai's control was less about walls and more about systems, less about fortresses and more about flow. Far to the south, a great Zimbabwe rose from the savannah. Its massive stone walls and intricate enclosures were more than architecture. They were a statement of organized society. Constructed without mortar, without the architectural technology of Europe, they stretched over miles. Great Zimbabwe was the heart of a kingdom that commanded trade, coordinated labor, and symbolized authority with elegance and ingenuity. The city itself became a beacon. Power encoded in stone, not a throne. And further east along the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, the kingdom of Axum projected influence across continents. Axum's merchants traded with Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean world. Its coins circulated far beyond the African continent. Its ports became hubs of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Authority was not confined to the palace. It flowed through ships, agreements, and trade networks that connected Africa to the broader world. These empires teach a vital lesson. Influence does not require imitation. Africa's rulers did not need European-style castles to command obedience or respect. Their systems were elegant, resilient, and often decentralized, but they were no less powerful. Governance, commerce, and culture combined into a form of authority that spanned rivers, deserts, and seas. Even more remarkable, these societies balanced tradition with innovation. Leadership was codified in law, ceremonial practices reinforced unity, and trade created wealth that fueled cities and armies alike. Their power was both visible and invisible. Stone walls and river systems, coinage and contracts, diplomacy and trade, all integrated seamlessly. Europe would later measure empire by the height of fortresses or the grandeur of palaces. Africa measured it differently. It measured it by reach, efficiency, and the ability to sustain society across vast and diverse lands. Their influence crossed borders, crossed oceans, and endured long after individual rulers passed. They ruled without castles, but their influence crossed oceans. In a world that often equates visibility with legitimacy, these African empires remind us that power can be quiet, adaptive, and pervasive. Strength is not always monumentality. Sometimes it is movement, organization, and the subtle art of connection. In their rivers, cities, and trade networks, Africa's empires built foundations of authority that rivaled any European kingdom, without ever needing the trappings that later historians would claim defined civilization. Chapter 5: The Silence That Followed. Africa's empires did not vanish quietly. They were not suddenly conquered and forgotten. History did not simply overlook them. It deliberately turned its gaze elsewhere. By the late 15th century, the contours of power began to shift. Trade routes that had connected the Niger, the Nile, and the Indian Ocean to the wider world were disrupted. New European maritime powers carved new paths, bypassing centuries-old networks. Gold and salt, once the lifeblood of African wealth, flowed into the hands of distant empires. The world's attention moved north and east, leaving Africa at the margins of maps drawn by outsiders. Invaders arrived with more than armies. They arrived with stories. They wrote the narrative, deciding what counted as history and what did not. Kingdoms that had governed with law, education, and trade were recast as tribal or primitive. Cities like Timbuktu and Great Zimbabwe, once hubs of intellect and commerce, were described as empty, exotic, or mysterious ruins. The African continent, in the eyes of the world, had become a blank page. Colonization was not just territorial, it was conceptual. By erasing Africa's historical agency, colonizers could justify exploitation, slavery, and extraction. If Africa had no history, its people could be framed as lacking civilization, lacking governance, lacking knowledge. The narrative became a tool of power, as sharp and effective as any army. Even today, the echoes of that erasure linger. Textbooks skip centuries of African innovation. Museums display gold artifacts without context. Scholars debate European empires, while the empires that financed, fed, and educated them remain footnotes. Africa's story exists, but only when someone digs deep enough, questions enough, and resists the silence imposed over centuries. And yet, the evidence persists. Manuscripts, stone cities, river systems, and oral traditions endure. They testify to a time when Africa shaped global commerce, knowledge, and governance. They remind us that power can be quiet, decentralized, and easily overlooked until it is studied with care. The erasure was never absolute. Africa's memory survives in the manuscripts of Timbuktu, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, and the legacy of Mali and Songhai. The continent was never powerless. It was misrepresented, its authority rewritten by those who benefited most from its invisibility. History did not forget Africa. It was buried. And so, as we look back across the centuries, we must ask, What else has been buried? Which stories have been hidden to serve the ambitions of others? The past is never as simple as it appears. Power does not always vanish. It can be silenced. Its presence remains, even if the world refuses to see it. Empires don't always fall. Sometimes they are buried. If Africa once ruled the world, what else has history taught us not to see?